After the massive success of Resident Evil 2, Capcom started making a whole bunch of Resident Evil projects for a variety of consoles. One of the simpler among these projects was a port of Resident Evil 2 for the Sega Saturn. This port would eventually be cancelled due to the weaker hardware of the Saturn not being able to run the game smoothly without making major cuts to the gameplay experience. So Capcom would ask series producer Shinji Mikami to make an original RE game for Sega's upcoming Dreamcast to appease the Sega fans. This Dreamcast title would end up becoming a proper mainline entry, with it seeing both Chris and Claire Redfield returning in their fight against Umbrella. This puts it in a pretty weird spot, as this game is incredibly important to the storyline of the numbered RE games, but since it was a non-numbered entry that was made exclusively for the Dreamcast, it's often forgotten about, or just overlooked in discussions about the franchise today. So is Resident Evil Code Veronica a game worth remembering, or have many forgotten about it for a reason? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 5th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise. While you don't have to have seen the first few videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with those games if you haven't seen them. So for those of you that want to check those out first, I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil Code Veronica is a survival horror game developed and published by Capcom and released for the Dreamcast in February of 2000. The game is set 3 months after the Raccoon City outbreak seen in Resident Evil 2 and 3, and opens with returning character Claire Redfield raiding an Umbrella Corporation facility in Paris in search of her brother, Chris Redfield. She's eventually captured by Umbrella forces on site and brought to a prison on the remote Rockford Island, an island owned by the Umbrella Corporation that they use to imprison their enemies and traitors to the company. Shortly after Claire is imprisoned, there's a sudden outbreak of the T-virus on the island, meaning that we need to escape and find a way off this rock before we're eaten alive by zombies. And I'm more than happy to report that after the strange departure that was Resident Evil Survivor, Code Veronica takes the series back to its classic formula. Tank controls, fixed cameras, exploration, puzzles, everything is back to what we saw in the original trilogy. So if you've played any of the PS1 trilogy, then you'll feel right at home here in CV. And with the series now free from the PS1's hardware and the limitations that came with it, there's a massive graphical leap between Code Veronica and games like RE2 or 3. Something that players of those games will almost immediately notice is that the pre-rendered backgrounds the series has used up to this point are now gone, and the environments here are actually fully 3D. You'd think that this would make the game look weaker overall because of how much more strain it would put on the system, but there are numerous things that make the 3D environments a really fun evolution. The camera is still placed in fixed positions like it is in the classic games, meaning we still get all the suspense and cinematic flair that longtime RE fans know and love. Something that's pretty fun though is that the game now has some angles where the camera will do things like pan around the room with the player or track them as they move down a long hallway. Additionally, there are way more dynamic lighting elements throughout the game now, as there are actual 3D objects everywhere for the light to bounce off of. And even though you lose that sort of 3D models popping off the screen effect from the older games, the designers still did an amazing job using the lighting and the colors to ensure that interactable objects always stand out so you won't just walk right past them. The only thing that I don't love about Code Veronica's visuals is the super heavy fog that's present throughout most of the game. In certain areas, it can be super atmospheric, but I don't need to have this weird haze in the background of every single shot in the game. This fog was probably added to help with performance, since the team was pushing such high fidelity in both the environments and the models this time around, but I found myself really wishing that I could see some areas of this game without the fog so that I could really take in the art direction. Fog aside though, I think that Code Veronica is a really good looking game, especially when you consider that it was released at the very beginning of 2000. But with visuals now out of the way, let's talk gameplay. The best way that I could describe Code Veronica would be to say that it's the classic formula that made Resident Evil so successful, but every aspect of it has been taken to the extreme. To start, CV has the longest scenario campaign in the series up to this point. It only has one scenario, but you'll play as both Claire and Chris at different points in this singular campaign, essentially just taking the A and B scenarios from RE2 and condensing them into one playthrough. An average playthrough of Code Veronica will run you about 12 hours if you're not overly familiar with the game, and my recent playthrough for this video even pushed 10 hours, despite the fact that I've played it multiple times before. To put that into perspective, my playthrough of Code Veronica for this video took more time to get through than playing the original game twice did when I was making that video, and even took nearly as long as the first 3 playthroughs I did for the RE2 video. This length is great for people who like to get more bang for their buck out of games like this, though the pacing is pretty inconsistent. I personally feel like the first half of the game has incredible pacing, but pretty much as soon as Chris comes into the picture, the game starts to drag a little bit. Chris shows up about 2/3 of the way into the game, and his portions largely revolve around backtracking through areas that Claire has already opened up. There are new rooms, enemies, and puzzles added for when you go through as Chris, but I find that I can just never shake the feeling that I'm spending way longer in these areas than I really should be. Good pacing in a Resident Evil game, in my opinion, largely comes down to making sure that players spend long enough in an area to feel accomplished for having eventually unraveled it, but not spending so long in it that it starts to become uninteresting. And unfortunately, I find that Code Veronica perfectly nails that during Claire's sections, but Chris's just lead to us spending way too long in areas that we've already spent a ton of time in. But back on the topic of taking things to the extreme, CV absolutely packs in the enemies, much like how RE3 did. The enemy counts aren't quite as high as what we saw in that game, but they make up for it by doing some pretty wild stuff, like giving massive buffs to the zombies. The zombies in Code Veronica are much faster than we've ever seen them before, meaning they're capable of cornering and ganging up on you much more quickly than they have in previous games if you're using weaker weapons like a pistol or a crossbow. There are also a ton of new zombie variants that will take you by surprise if you're not already aware of them. Things like zombies strapped with explosives that will blow up when you shoot them, or the new parasite zombies that can literally shoot a parasite out of their body that will latch onto and poison you. There are also some entirely new enemies here too that are all incredibly dangerous in their own right. Like the new Bandersnatches with all of their obnoxious stretchy arm attacks that can hit you from across the room, and even a new Hunter variant that will poison you on contact. A lot of areas in Code Veronica will also repopulate with enemies when you move through them multiple times, which is something that I'm pretty mixed on. While having enemies respawn like this during backtracking can definitely keep the tensions high, it does sort of disrupt the careful decision-making process of choosing between clearing out an area or taking the risk of just running past the enemies. To make up for this though, ammo is much more abundant throughout the game, and Code Veronica also boasts the largest roster of weapons out of all the RE games so far. There are even some awesome new dual-wieldable weapons that are capable of targeting multiple enemies at once while firing, which, while not the most practical addition to the game, they are just really fun to use. The only thing missing when it comes to the weapons is the ammo crafting system that we saw in RE3, which is strangely absent here. If we're being honest, it isn't really needed thanks to how much ammo is just laying around the environments, but it definitely could have been fun to include anyway. I always really liked that dynamic of making the decision between having a ton of pistol ammo or saving your gunpowders to make things like grenade launcher rounds, so it is a little sad to see that that didn't return here. Even with all this firepower laying around though, the difficulty in CV is pretty brutal even for experienced Resident Evil players. You might have already noticed that I'm limping around in almost all of my footage here, and that's no coincidence. Everything that I've already mentioned about how the game has been made more difficult led to me being injured for almost my entire run, and also led to Code Veronica boasting the highest death count of any playthrough for the series so far. I mean, just let that sink in real quick. Even without a crazy recurring boss like Nemesis, CV still managed to kill me more times than RE3 did. So if you're planning on checking out Code Veronica and you haven't done so yet, definitely make sure that you've played some of the earlier titles first so you don't end up just throwing yourself to the wolves here. Moving on to some more miscellaneous things, the quick turn from RE3 thankfully made its way into Code Veronica. A lot of the improvements that RE3 brought actually didn't make their way into Code Veronica, most likely because the two games were in development by two different teams at the same time. But if you had asked me what one change from RE3 I would carry over to CV, I probably would have said the quick turn, so this is another great addition here. Unfortunately though, that means that the emergency dodge mechanic was one of the few things that didn't make its way over. I never really cared much about that before, but after finally learning how to use the emergency dodge during my recent RE3 playthrough, I really did find myself missing it here. That being said, an argument could definitely be made that it wouldn't really fit the tone of Code Veronica anyway, but I do think it could have been fun if it returned here. One really cool addition that the Dreamcast made possible is displaying the player's health on the controller's VMU screen. If you aren't familiar with the Dreamcast, the controller had a little memory card in it that included a small screen display. So the developers of Code Veronica had the brilliant thought of what if we threw the player's health on there so they don't have to open up their inventory to check it every single time they get hit. Now, all you have to do is look down at your controller and boom, there's your current health right there. And thankfully, the emulator I used to upscale the game for my footage allows you to toggle the VMU display on screen with the press of a single button, so I've got some clips in here that can kind of show you what it's like to just check it real quick while you play. It's honestly one of the smallest additions in the game, but it's also one of the coolest and most creative at the same time. And probably the most miscellaneous of all the miscellaneous notes I have here, you can no longer pop the zombies' heads off with the shotgun. Weirdly though, if you try to do it, you'll still hear the head pop sound effect from previous games, as well as see a bunch of random chunks fly out in all directions, but their heads just stay intact now. This is a really weird change, and while I can't really find anything about why it was done, it seems that most people assume this was just another small censorship change they made due to the strong anti-violence in video games movements at the time. I mean, it led to us losing the ability to play Survivor with the gun con here in the West, so it's not exactly a stretch to assume that that's also why the zombies' heads don't explode anymore. It makes the shotgun way less satisfying to use here than it was in the original trilogy, but at least the one-shot kill mechanic is still intact. And that's about all I have for the gameplay, so let's talk a bit about Code Veronica's story. I do have one quick thing to talk about that's not going to spoil the game for people, and that's the new main character that CV introduces. Say hello to Steve Burnside. Steve's father was an Umbrella employee who was caught selling off information to the highest bidder, earning him and his entire family a spot here in the Rockford Island prison. Players will meet Steve roughly 10 minutes into the game, and he and Claire will work together to escape throughout the rest of it. He's a really weird character because he has a genuinely compelling background and some really good writing, but oh my god, his voice actor.
You'll just end up disappointed if you rely on others. Believe me, I know.
What was that all about?
Steve has a reputation for being one of the most annoying characters in the Resident Evil franchise, and it's almost entirely because of his actor's performance. I personally don't dislike him as much as most people do, because like I said, he is well written despite the poor voice acting. That, and he also has an incredibly strong Canadian accent, which as someone from the North myself, I just can't help but find endearing.
Sorry about that little misunderstanding, but I thought you were another one of those monsters.
Shut up!
But from this point on, I'm going to be spoiling the story. So as always, if you're trying to avoid spoilers for Code Veronica, skip to the timestamp on screen. Alright, so now that I can't be blamed for spoiling the game, the best way I can describe Code Veronica's story would be to tell you that it is batshit crazy. As players work on escaping from Rockford Island, they'll also slowly learn about the history of the Ashford family. This is a long family line of monarchs and nobles that are very directly tied to the founding of Umbrella, and a pair of twins from this family, Alfred and Alexia Ashford, are the current overseers of the island. Early on in the game, you'll mostly run into Alfred Ashford and learn about his, well, let's just say, questionable fixation with his twin sister. Players will also run into Alexia during this portion of the game, but just less so than they do Alfred. Near the end of this section though, we learn that Alfred and Alexia have actually been the same person the whole time that we've been on the island. Alexia is a real person, but it turns out that Alfred lost her due to some unknown Umbrella experiment and was unable to cope with the loss. As a result, he developed a sort of split personality and started to cross-dress as Alexia and pretend to be her. Not long after this bizarre revelation though, we managed to escape from the island using a plane we found in a nearby hangar. As we're flying off though, Steve loses control of the plane, and Alfred contacts us to say that he's taken control of the plane's autopilot remotely. From here, he flies us to yet another remote Umbrella facility in the Antarctic, which is where most of the second half of the game takes place. The T-Virus has also made its way here after other refugees from Rockford Island tried to escape to this base, meaning we're far from being free from the monsters here. As we explore the facility, we're ambushed once again by Alfred, and Steve ends up fatally wounding him. Before he bleeds out though, he crawls his way down into the deepest levels of the facility and releases a test subject from the secret labs down there. And it just so happens that this test subject is Alexia. As it turns out, Alexia had been working on developing a new strain of the T-virus that she called the T Veronica virus. She was having little luck with human test subjects, as they all died and turned to zombies before she could gather any substantial results. So in a desperate effort to perfect the virus, she infected herself with a sample of it and put herself on ice, telling Alfred to wake her back up after 15 years have passed. And of course, this game's events just so happen to take place around that 15-year mark. We quickly learn that the experiment was a success, as she's gained all the superhuman abilities that she was hoping for without dying or becoming a mindless monster. She uses her new abilities to prevent Claire and Steve from escaping the facility, and here we suddenly cut back to Rockford Island. Here, we see Chris Redfield's triumphant entrance into the game, with him having finally arrived at Rockford Island after being told by Leon Kennedy that Claire was being held there. This portion of the game is largely just an extension of the island area with little story content to really speak of, but it does contain what might be the most important plot point of the game. It's here that we learn that Albert Wesker actually survived the events of the first game, and he tells Chris that he's working for an organization that sent him here to retrieve a sample of the T Veronica virus. He then attacks Chris, revealing himself to now be some sort of superhuman and expressing how much hatred he has for him after the events of RE1. Chris stands zero chance against Wesker in a fight, but ends up getting lucky as Alexia suddenly appears on a nearby monitor, causing Wesker to rush off to find her. After a little more backtracking, Chris manages to find a jet and flies himself over to the Antarctic facility where he meets up with Claire again. From here, there's not much else that's really worth mentioning specifically, other than the fate of Steve Burnside. Right near the end of the game, Steve is captured by Alexia and infected with the T Veronica virus, which ultimately kills him and causes him to transform into a giant monster. This is honestly a shame because as annoying as Steve is throughout the game, I stand by the fact that he's really only held back by his voice actor's performance, and I think that he really could have become a fan favorite if he had stuck around throughout the years and gotten more development throughout the rest of the series. From here, Chris and Claire eventually defeat Alexia in a big final boss fight and manage to escape from the facility. So yeah, like I said, this game has a pretty crazy story. It definitely feels much more out there than any Resident Evil story seen before it, but in all honesty, I've always found it incredibly entertaining. Things like the Ashford twins and Wesker's superpowered return to the story are definitely much wackier than what we saw in the previous games, but they're also just really fun. It's also great to see Chris and Claire on screen together for the first time, and while it's a shame that Steve was thrown out so quickly, I really do find that every character in this story is compelling or entertaining in their own unique way. It's definitely not a story for everyone, but I've always found Code Veronica's story to be super enjoyable every time I come back to it, and I would 100% recommend it to any RE fans who aren't totally caught up on the series taking itself seriously. And I feel a very similar way about Code Veronica as a whole. It might not appeal to those who strictly enjoy what the original trilogy did and just want more games that are exactly like those three, but if you're willing to give CV a little wiggle room to do its own thing, you'll likely find yourself enjoying it quite a bit. Code Veronica has always been a weird one for me because I tend to feel like it's an okay game that's just not quite as good as the original trilogy, but then I'll replay it and find myself shocked at how much I enjoyed it. And if you couldn't tell, that cycle repeated itself just this week. I sat down to start this video thinking, yeah, Code Veronica is a solid game, but just not as good as the first few. But now, I'm gonna sit here and tell you that I really don't think that's true. It has its issues with things like poor pacing in the later half of the game, or the sometimes frustrating difficulty, but it's a really solid product if you can persevere through those aspects. Every game in the original RE trilogy has its weak spots, and Code Veronica is no different from those. A lot of the smaller aspects that make classic RE feel like classic RE are honestly at their best here, and the difficulty, while challenging, is super satisfying to overcome. This puts Code Veronica in a weird spot, with parts of the Resi formula being at their absolute best so far, while others are at their absolute worst. It might not be as consistently strong as a lot of the original trilogy was, but when it's firing on all cylinders, it really offers some of the best classic RE gameplay that you're likely to come across. If you're a Resident Evil fan who's been putting off Code Veronica, I seriously recommend that you check it out. And if you're a new fan who's just dipping their toes into the series, I would definitely make sure that you play Code Veronica somewhere along your journey. It really is a game worth playing, and if you ever catch me saying otherwise, please remind me of everything that I've just said here, because I'm probably just back in that Code Veronica cycle. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil Code Veronica an 8.8. Hey guys, thanks for making it through another whole video of me shamelessly glazing Resident Evil. If you're enjoying these videos and want to send a little extra support my way, feel free to check out my Patreon or even just the channel memberships right here on YouTube. It really does go a long way towards helping cover the costs of the channel, especially when it comes to things like importing more obscure titles from other countries, which is maybe something I had to do for next week's video, but we'll get there when we get there. Anyway, thanks again guys, and I hope to see all of you right here on the next Resident Evil review.